Okay, good evening, friends. My name is Joseph Gerson. I'm with the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and a member of the Mass Peace Actions Board. In a few weeks, we get to move Donald Trump and his corrupt clan from the White House to Mar-a-Lago. That said, among other things, we now face the question of if and how the Biden administration will change its policies when it comes to China, Russia, and Korea. There is talk about a possible détente, simultaneous competition and cooperation with China, and the extension of the New START treaty with Russia. But Biden is just as committed to U.S. hegemony, to the pivot to Asia, and to military, economic, diplomatic, and soft power Cold Wars with China and Russia as Trump and Obama were before him. And he said almost nothing about Korea, except that he's eager to reinforce U.S. military alliances. So we have our work cut out for us. Over the last couple of months, several Boston area peace and justice organizations have come together to promote movement building to prevent great power conflict. With this evening's webinar, we are happy to be launching our popular education organizing with an exceptional panel of analysts and activists. Let me introduce our speakers in the order that they will be speaking. Jody Evans is a lifelong peace and social justice activist and a co-founder of Code Pink, Women for Peace. She serves on numerous boards fostering environmental, educational, socio-political, and healthcare causes. These include Rainforest Action Network, where she is the board chair, Institute for Policy Studies, and the California Arts Council. And if you've been paying attention in recent years, you've seen her featured in numerous Code Pink actions. John Pfeffer is the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. I've known and worked with John over many years. He generously served as my host and guide when I first visited South Korea more than 20 years ago. John is the Senior Associate at the Asia Institute in Seoul and has been both a writing fellow at Provisions Library in Washington, D.C., and a Pan-Tech Fellow in Korean Studies at Stanford University. He's a former associate editor at World Policy Journal and served as the American Friends Service Committee's representative in Korea, Kosovo as well, if I remember correctly. His most recent book is The Pandemic Pivot. I have also had the privilege of long working with Hyun Lee. She is the U.S. National Organizer for the 2020 Women-led Korea Peace Treaty campaign. She is a writer for Zoom in Korea, an online resource for critical news and analysis on peace and democracy in Korea. She is an anti-war activist and organizer who has traveled to both North and South Korea. She is a Korea Policy Institute associate and routinely speaks at national and international conferences, webinars, and public seminars. And she has recently been involved in the development of an action plan for 3 nationwide networks who are collaborating to impact the Biden administration's approach to North Korea. After Jody, John, and Hyun speak, we will have time for a question and answer session. Please either post your questions using the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, or raise your blue hand, which you can do via the participants function. So thank you again for joining us. And Jody, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking at all of you and having just a heart swelling for old white people. I want to say, we know how small the movement is for peace, and it's something we work on at Code Pink every day to grow. And my heart is just swollen in gratitude. And I know so many of you, and I've been in the streets with you and worked with you, and just, yes, the peace, we at Code Pink, we just finished our first day of our advance because we don't retreat. And one of the things we spoke about was, what are we going to do when this, this giant peace movement fades away, that we have a lot of work to do to inspire a new one. I also want to just raise up the International Day of Solidarity for Palestine, which is being celebrated today. Palestine always in my heart. And I think it's important to recognize a day where we celebrate our stand against imperialism, but I think so many of us know that that is our task every day. So my biggest concern is that Code Pink started around the Iraq War. Bush was frightening us into war with his color-coded alerts, orange, red, and yellow, and we called Code Pink for peace. And here there was a narrative being driven by fear and hate, and that narrative, now we have a narrative being driven with fear and hate towards China. What we know is that's more investment in weapons and war, and a new Cold War that could lead to the destabilization of Asia as it did the Middle East. But this time it is nuclear. There are real weapons of mass destruction. And if these bombs are dropped, it is a nuclear winter. But since the Iraq War, there's a different world out there, a bit smarter. And but Biden is not smarter. Biden says he wants to be head of a global foreign policy table, but we as feminists, we want a round table of cooperation, diplomacy, and respect. We want to build a global community that represents democracy, a word the US throws around and has little clue of what it means. Our concern is that Biden has a lot of old ideas. My concern about him is personal. He arrested me the day the Iraq War was being debated in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, of which he chaired, when he got up and said that we need to bomb Iraq to peace. And I stood up screaming that you cannot bomb anyone to peace. And he immediately had me arrested. So there's no accountability, kind of thanks to Obama, who said, let's look forward and not back. But just as we're learning from the Black community on racism, we must look back and hold those who participated in the worst foreign policy blunder in history to be held accountable. All those who believed in war and militarism are now in power. How did this happen? And how do we raise it now? Especially now in this time where we also have a community really rising up the cost of racism, and where militarism and racism are totally related. We need to be as vocal and firm and unpacking of the history as we are seeing the leadership in the Black community. Biden says he's appointing people with experience, but their experience is invading Afghanistan, Iran, Libya, and wanting to be more engaged in Syria. We're seeing a softer, gentler interventionist with Biden and those around him, which, like Trump, is yet another embodiment of what the US big picture is. The US, the face with a smile that goes and rapes and pillages Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, that believes it's doing good while killing people for its own greedy needs. It's the interventionist with a nice face or white gloves, or I don't know what kind of metaphor you want to use. But the world sees us as the continued ugly American, and that is becoming more and more the worldview. Well, Michele Flournoy is not such a nice face, but she's definitely imperialism in heels, even though she's managed to make friends with the arms control community because she supports the renewal of the START Treaty. It's clear that they're trying to shore up allies in the progressive movement to protect their backs on other less palatable issues. Michele Flournoy wants to fund high-tech weapons, and she wants to spend a lot more money on them. Yes, she's opposing some of the nuclear weapons, but she's not interested in stopping the investment in weapons. She has supported all the wars we've been engaged in. She sees China as the enemy and demands that we build a new weapon systems to meet them. One of her quotes recently was, she wants the ability to in 72 hours wipe out the naval fleet of China. I mean, that's how specific it is in her brain. She agrees the US use of force is key to getting resources. So for her, rape and pillage is fine. And of course, this team will play lip service to diplomacy while having no idea what it means, especially when Biden says sitting at the top of the table. And they also, all of them have in some way spoken that they want to use military force as a part of diplomacy, which is not diplomacy, like we don't have democracy. It will be hard to cut the Pentagon budget with this administration when we see so many of those that he's putting into foreign policy positions who want to spend more money. But we have to continue to work to cut the Pentagon and really build the intersectional movement that can do it, because that money needs to move to the needs of the people and what, as we were learning with COVID, are essential needs. Also, the Biden team are tied to the revolving door between the Pentagon think tanks and the investment firms. Michele Flournoy is quite astounding in that she goes inside and then outside. The Center for the New American Security gets money from military contractors. She's on the board of Booz Hamilton, which has billions in military investments, and her West X is like about the, how close they are to the White House and how much they can affect it for the weapons industry. It's been called the waiting station for those who go in and out of government. And we're not so thrilled about Avril Haines, who was big champion of the drones. Michele Flournoy, I mean, we just recently even found out about Pine Island Capital that she's a part of that makes money from weapons. And besides being an imperialist in heels, she's also a capitalist imperialist on steroids. So we'll be calling for feminism, not militarism. 2 years ago, we started a feminist foreign policy project that we will work to show the distinctions between the imperialists and the patriarchs in heels and what a feminist foreign policy truly could look like. Fortunately, the Republicans also want to know who the people are that are Flournoy's clients. She has non-disclosure agreements with them, and we've not been able to find out who she's in bed with, but they're wanting to know who's going to run the Pentagon, who they're sleeping with. And so we're hoping that during the appointment process, we'll be able to raise this. And you can help us stop even her appointment by getting engaged. Angela is going to post in the chat how you can say no to Michele Flournoy. I know none of us are going to like who gets that appointment, but I don't know if there could be anyone as bad as her. So we have a bunch of friendly warmongers and capitalists that are coming into the administration. The BlackRock guy is yet another nice guy. So I think it's a lot about wolves in sheep clothing. Blinken, comes off as a really nice guy. Some of us had conversations with him, super nice, but his ideas are really scary. He's super enamored with NATO. He was already critical of moving troops from Germany and clearly wants to antagonize Russia, but I'll leave that to later speakers. So bringing it into NATO is going to be difficult during this administration. Even Neera Tanden, who's now going to be at OMB, we remember her when the WikiLeaks exposures came out, that in her email she said resource extraction in Libya was justified given the US deficit. These people are really scary, that they believe that war is a tool to rape and pillage and keep US hegemony. At Code Pink, we see our main openings for immediate victories around Yemen and Iran. If we could move those, it would change a lot in the Middle East. The downside is that Biden is incredibly pro-Israel. We are not sure how that's going to affect these other two, but the War Powers Act on Yemen is on the move and will be ready for the new administration. We just released a letter today that Angela can put in the chat that you can sign on to. but we'll also be focusing on no weapon sales to the Middle East, so that we can stop the flow of weapons, because nothing good comes out of that except making the rich richer. Trump is making sure to leave Iran a huge mess, and Biden is not that good at diplomacy. So we know that a lot of our work is going to be bringing a peace deal with Iran to the table. And you know, that kind of goes hand in hand with the sanctions, which will continue to focus on. Unfortunately, Biden's also bad on sanctions, even around Cuba. But we hope that we hope that they will be loosening some of the sanctions, but we will continue to raise the issue as a crime against humanity and the worst tool of this imperialist government. One of the areas and how we're gonna, you know, capture it is we've just launched a Good Neighbor campaign to kind of pull all the Latin America campaigns together. You know, we've learned in COVID that it's good to be a good neighbor. And so the US needs to get their knee off the throat of Latin America and just leave her be. So much damage has been done, and it continues to play out with the US finding all the ways it can destabilize Latin America and then not take any responsibilities. Also not taking in the refugees and the asylum seekers from the meddling. And Angela will put in the chat how you can find out more about our Good Neighbor policy.
Jody, about another minute or so? About another minute or so?
Oh, shit. Okay, well, so let me get to China. And you can ask me questions in the Q&A. But China is going to be one of our major focuses, and we've been doing this all year, building teaching tools. We know that, you know, the Cold War was driven more by the US, just as all the wars. We know that it's being driven by lies, as with all the wars, and it is going to be up to the peace movement to unpack those lies. And, you know, it doesn't matter all the lies. There is no excuse for a war on China. Last week, there was an op-ed by the former foreign minister of China, Fu Ying, about the need for cooperative competition between the US and China. And it is going to be up to us, the peace movement, to be unpacking those lies and calling them out and saying that none of these lies are okay. There is no reason to be at war with China. And I'll post in the chat all the actions you can engage with on the racism that it's driving, on the need for health and cooperation. We got 113 members of Congress to support. We are now doing a letter to Biden from the environmental movement, the need for his cooperation with China on the environmental movement that ex-Governor Jerry Brown here in California is leading, and on Africa, that they are driving a story out of Africa on China colonizing Africa that the Africans don't believe is true. And that we have a coalition that grows every day, both outside the Beltway, inside the Beltway, and globally, that I hope you'll be engaged with. And I'll just post more in the chat. That went fast, sorry.
Thank you, Jody. That's really quite comprehensive. John, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, Joseph. And interesting.
Like it didn't get the whole of your screen or something.
Yeah. Oh, I see. I think I did the wrong one. How's
There
that?
we go. That's more like it.
Yeah, that was my my compressed version, I guess, my 1 minute talk. Okay, so what I was saying is basically I'm going to talk about Russia, but a lot of what I say can apply to China as well. Basically, what I see coming up for the Biden administration is selective engagement with Russia and selective confrontation, which is essentially the same for China as well. Biden, of course, has said very clearly in October that he thinks that Russia is a major threat, and Russia's a threat. It will serve as a rationale for the kind of Pentagon spending that Jody was talking about. It also serves as a kind of cohesive force to bring our allies together transatlantically in NATO. And then, of course, Russia is seen as a threat because it's a friend of our adversaries, whether they're Venezuela or Iran or Syria. Putin has not been enthusiastic about Biden either. He hasn't called to welcome as president. He still serves as a candidate in his mind. But I would like to point out that from Putin's point of view, Biden is at least more predictable than Trump, and that there are certain advantages to predictability. However, he is, of course, a liberal, and Putin is very clearly aligning himself in an illiberal camp with illiberals around the world, or non-liberals. And so Biden's liberal internationalism rubs Putin the wrong way. There's, of course, hostility to the EU that Putin has, hostility to kind of liberal social policy, all of which will be kind of points of confrontation with a Biden administration. Of course, the history here is that Biden was the front person for the Obama administration in 2009 for the reset with Russia. And that was a reset that was largely predicated on economic relations. There was a view somehow that Russia and America could get along with trade and on economic issues, even if there were going to be some disagreements. It was a reset that didn't last very long, of course. And there were a number of reasons for the kind of downturn in US-Russian relations. I'm going to go through a couple of examples of where there's been a confrontation, and then I'll look at some potential for cooperation between the United States and Russia moving forward. One major point of conflict, of course, was NATO expansion. And from Russia's point of view, and you can see here that the blue is NATO, that basically NATO is marching eastward, especially between 1999 and 2004, incorporation of the Baltics here into NATO. The green is, of course, Ukraine and Georgia, with conversations taking place there with the potential someday of NATO involvement. But you can see with Russia, certainly a perception that they're being surrounded by NATO. Obviously, the war in Ukraine, Russia's incorporation of Crimea, the Donetsk and Luhansk separatist regions. The United States imposes sanctions on Russia after the incorporation of Crimea. This continues to be obviously a sore point between the United States and Russia. Petropolitics, there is Russia, of course, is a major energy producer, oil, natural gas. It has tried to sell that natural gas to European nations, especially Germany. The Nord Stream is a gas pipeline that runs, as you see, not territorially through potentially contested territory like Ukraine, but underwater. And the United States has tried to persuade Germany not to accept this kind of energy from Russia. Germany is countered with a proposal to perhaps take both the natural gas from Russia, but also buy it from the United States. So that's kind of the German compromise. Human rights, Putin, of course, has cracked down on civil society within his own country. And the United States, during the Obama administration, of course, took very strong positions on human rights, at least rhetorically. Trump, of course, did not care at all about human rights. But it's not just, of course, the human rights within Russia itself, but of course, Russia's support for human rights abusing regimes in the region, such as Lukashenko in Belarus. Assassinations that Russia has been engaged in overseas, obviously Litvinenko, but there have been quite a few others, both within Russia, Boris Nemtsev, Anna Politkovskaya, but also others outside of Russia, Sergei Skripal and others. Election interference, obviously, this was a point of contention in the final months of the Obama administration, but it continued throughout the Trump administration, even though Trump himself was not particularly concerned about Russian involvement. There are two pending pieces of legislation. I've listed them here. that could, again, levy additional sanctions on Russia. That will be an even greater point of conflict. But Putin himself has his concerns about US election interference or interference in politics, support of color revolutions along the perimeter or the periphery of Russia, whether in Ukraine, Georgia, or elsewhere. But now let's look at common interests, because this, I think, is where we can, really be a little bit more optimistic about what might happen in the Biden administration, though I am obviously as concerned as Jody is about the personnel that are coming in or potentially coming in. Obviously, New START, the nuclear arms control agreement, which expires on February 5th. So there's a narrow window between inauguration and the expiration of New START to extend it for another 5 years. There's good likelihood that that will take place, and there's obviously Russian interest in that. The two treaties that Trump withdrew from, INF, Intermediate Nuclear Force, and the Open Skies Agreement, a little bit more difficult for the United States to re-engage in that. Biden himself has in the past said that he supports a no first use policy, which would be a great step forward. We'll see if that takes place. He's also been supportive of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. More difficult, perhaps, to see the United States under the Biden administration taking a more progressive position would be on landmines and the arms trade treaty. But I would argue that these last four, or really the last five, assuming that that Biden moves ahead with New START, these are really progressive opportunities for the peace movement, I think, to really lobby hard the Biden administration. The Iran nuclear deal, of course, that is a little bit more complicated to simply renew on the US side. Biden has indicated his interest in doing so. It's, of course, a major victory from the Obama years. And this is something that, of course, Russia has supported and has continued to support even as Trump withdrew and, as Jody said, has applied a kind of scorched earth policy to make it as difficult as possible for a Biden administration to re-engage Iran. But here again, there's good likelihood of Russia and the United States seeing common ground on this issue. The pandemic, not a lot of cooperation between the Trump administration and anybody, frankly, including states here in the United States. But under a Biden administration, potentially some coordination, especially around vaccines. Russia has come up with its own vaccine, Sputnik 5, but not sure really how effective it's going to be. They've touted it as effective, but scientists are a little skeptical. It would be great if the United States and Russia would not only collaborate for, in terms of the two countries in vaccination, but collaborate in terms of ensuring free access and patent-free access to vaccinations around the world. Climate change is a little bit more complicated. Obviously, Russia is a major producer of fossil fuels. It's the fourth largest emitter of carbon emissions in the world. At the same time, Russia recognizes that it's warming pretty quickly. And here you have a picture of what's happening with the permafrost in Siberia. It would be wonderful if the Biden administration, John Kerry, as the climate czar, would re-engage Russia and, of course, China on these issues and really get Russia to commit to a much more ambitious plan for 2030. Putin has put out his own plan for 2030, but frankly, it's a really lousy one. Now, I'll finish with just a couple of challenges for the two countries. Whoops. Syria is, of course, one of them. The Biden administration probably will not put Syria very high in its priority list. So it's likely that this won't be as much of a point of friction as it might otherwise be. But the fact that that Biden would like to see some reduction in troops, but not a full reduction in troops, and his past support of Kurds in the north suggests that there will continue to be some confrontation between the United States and Russia around Syria. But a lot of that depends on Turkey. And here we really see a US-Russian confrontation because Erdogan, pictured here, has purchased a major Russian weapons system. I mean, Turkey's a member of NATO. What's it doing purchasing Russian weapons? Obviously, Biden is going to try to pressure Erdogan. You know, it's not going to be possible to send them back, but perhaps not to deploy this anti-missile system that Turkey bought. But a lot of that will depend, again, on Biden's position about Kurds in northern Syria. So there's a lot of balancing that will take place in the first months of the Biden administration involving Russia, Turkey, and Syria. And then finally, China. I mean, I do think that we'll see the same kind of policy roughly toward China as we see toward Russia. In other words, selective engagement, selective confrontation. As Jody was talking about, the prospects for collaboration on climate change is actually very strong. And I would urge, if there's one action item I would urge, it's for the Biden administration to re-up the clean energy consortium that it has set up with China. It's a 10-year period that elapses in 2021. It's perhaps the most important collaborative project on environment between the United States and China. It's an easy win. It's not that political. It was maintained during the Trump administration. So I see that as really a positive. But the key issue here is in the triangle between the United States, Russia, and China, the more conflict there will be between the United States and Russia, the closer Russia will move to China, the greater interest they will find in common in the face of a hostile United States. And I'll end with this quote from Dmitry Suslov, who's a very interesting analyst. Basically, what he's saying is that Putin doesn't really expect Biden to be able to do much in foreign policy, that, you know, Congress is going to be deadlocked. It's going to be tough to push through anything through the Senate, and Biden's going to be focused on domestic issues. So whatever political capital he has, he's not going to be interested in expending it on well, a breakthrough in U.S.-Russian relations. And as such, you know, what is Russia going to do in response? It's not going to do a lot. It's not going to push too hard, and it's not going to expend its own political capital on a reset with the United States. In that circumstance, what Russia will do will simply prioritize its relations with other countries. So here we have an opportunity for the Biden administration to engage Russia, to engage China. If it does not, it will see basically these countries move closer together, and that will pose certain challenges, although there will be certain advantages to that geopolitically as well, which I can talk about in the Q&A. Thanks.
John, thank you very much for that comprehensive and condensed overview. Very, very helpful. We'll go to Hyun now, and before Cole Harrison coordinates the Q&A session, I will say a few words in terms of the U.S.-China confrontation and some alternatives. Go ahead, Hyun. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. Good to see some familiar faces. I'm going to also share my screen, so hopefully this will work the first time. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. So my job today is to talk about what the Biden administration will mean for U.S. DPRK relations. Okay, can you see the next page that I just scrolled to?
Yes,
okay.
Outline.
So this is the outline of my talk. I thought I would first start by recapping where the U.S.-North Korea talks left off, and then talk about what is the Biden team's view on North Korea, and talk about what does North Korea want, and then lastly end with what is the prospect for next year and what is the path towards peace. So first, where did the U.S. DPRK talks leave off? Well, 2018 seems like such a long ago now, but you will remember that there was an opportunity for a historic breakthrough. So there was a summit in Singapore between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, and they agreed on 4 key areas: establishing new relationship between the two countries, building a lasting and stable peace regime, complete denuclearization, and then the recovery of the U.S. service members' remains from the Korean War. This was heralded by peace activists, not just peace activists, actually, people all over the world. Unfortunately, it was quickly followed by a breakdown the following year in Hanoi. So there was another summit in Vietnam between the two leaders. And this summit broke down with no agreement. And we later found out, according to a Reuters article, that Trump basically gave Kim Jong-un a letter outlining the conditions for the talks, which basically amounted to CDID, complete verification, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea, unilateral disarmament of North Korea, which the North Koreans had previously rejected. But nonetheless, this is what was presented to them in Hanoi. The North Koreans rejected it again, and then they left without a deal. So that was followed by prolonged deadlock in 2019. A couple of months later, in April, Kim Jong-un gave a speech to the Supreme People's Assembly in North Korea, and he basically said, we will wait until the end of the year for the US to come back with a different kind of offer. Of course, the US did not do that. They maintained the position that North Korea should denuclearize first. So then the North Koreans continued to increase their missile capability. And we ended 2019, one of the last statements that we heard from North Korea in 2019 was by Kim Myung-gil, who's the ambassador of their foreign ministry. And he basically said, apparently Stephen Biegun, who is my counterpart in the US, the special representative, has been trying to get in touch with me. He sent me a letter through a third country saying that he wants to meet. I don't know why. He said, I don't know why he doesn't contact me directly. Then he said, we are ready to meet at any point. However, if the US failing to put forth a basic solution for lifting the anti-DPRK hostile policy, blah, 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 there is no possibility of the settlement of the issues. So this is what the North Koreans were waiting for, is for the US to put forth a basic solution for lifting the anti-North Korea hostile policy. And this is where things left off before everybody was blindsided by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is where the talks left off. So now we have a new administration in Washington. What is their view on North Korea? So let's start with Tony Blinken. He's the Secretary of State. He gave an interview on CBS News podcast in September, and a lot of it is what Jody and John have already mentioned. He says, if we don't lead, if the US doesn't lead in the world, then bad things will fill the vacuum. On China, it's our greatest challenge, combination of competition, cooperation, etc. Specifically on North Korea, he said the goal is a Korean peninsula free of nuclear weapons. Wow, that sounds great. So this is where I sat up and really listened, but then quickly he said some things that were very disappointing. So he said, Trump suspended military exercises, eased up on sanctions. And so what we got is North Korea increasing its nuclear and missile capabilities. Therefore, we have to work closely with allies, press China to build genuine economic pressure, squeeze North Korea, cut off its various avenues and access to resources. So he basically has an upside down view of the situation. When did the US ease up on sanctions on North Korea? The reason why North Korea increased its nuclear and missile capability is not because Trump eased up on sanctions and suspended military exercises. It's actually just the opposite. It's because Trump continued to maintain sanctions, in fact, tighten sanctions and continue the policy of maximal pressure, which is why North Korea continued to increase their missile capabilities. Michele Flournoy, whom Jody talked about, is the contender for the defense secretary position, and shares much the same view as Tony Blinken, and that's not a mistake, of course, because the two of them, they actually co-founded the same consulting firm that gives strategic advice to financial institutions. So their views are actually, foreign policy views are almost identical, especially on China. On North Korea specifically, she has said she will take a risk management approach, meaning just manage the problem, not try to seek a fundamental solution. The immediate priority is to stop North Korea's provocative behavior, layered approach. And then she said, we need to first pursue reduction of North Korea's nuclear weapons, and then hope the North Korea people will pursue a different leadership. So the way I read that statement is this is regime change by other means. Center for New American Security, which is the think tank that Michele Flournoy co-founded with Kurt Campbell. They responded to a national interest survey in August, where they said North Korea will probably be a higher foreign policy priority than before because it's because of its nuclear threat and relevance to US competition with China. And it had three recommendations. One, increase or maintain high pressure sanctions. Empower working level negotiators, meaning no high profile summits, and then focus on strengthening the trilateral alliance with South Korea and Japan. Joe Biden, on a call with President Moon right after the election, expressed the desire to strengthen the alliance as the linchpin of security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. Notice he used the language of Indo-Pacific, which is actually language that was promoted by the Trump administration to indicate bringing India into the fold, along with Australia and Japan, the Quad, basically, to contain China. And so the way I read this statement is that South Korea should join this effort, the US-led campaign to isolate China. So in sum, I think what we will see with the Biden administration in terms of its policy on North Korea will be three key aspects. One, continued pressure and isolation to basically disarm North Korea, increase in military strength, and then getting allies, a focus on getting allies on board as well as China on board to isolate North Korea. However, I should point out that this is exactly the same failed approach that led to North Korea building nuclear weapons in the first place. As you know, North Korea is not a country that likes to be managed. So it will undoubtedly continue its nuclear weapons and missile program. So unless this changes, this dynamic changes, I think that renewed tension between the two countries will not be a question of if, it will be a question of when. This is a question that I get a lot. People always ask me, what does North Korea want? And I always say, how should I know? I don't have no way of getting in touch with them. However, I think we can actually deduce what they want from their past statements. So let's begin with 1954, right after the Korean War. So as you might know, in 1953, the war was halted through a temporary ceasefire, an armistice. So in 1954, there was a conference of the great powers and the relevant parties of the conflict to discuss a permanent settlement. What do we do about the Korea situation? And North Korea's position at this conference was we need to convert the armistice into lasting peaceful reunification. And this conference ended without an agreement because the US side objected to this proposal. However, North Korea's basic position that we need to replace the armistice situation with a permanent peace regime has not changed. And actually it's a position that it's a call that they have made repeatedly in the past 7 decades. During the Cold War in 1974, the Supreme People's Assembly of North Korea sent a letter to the US Senate formally proposing talks for the conclusion of a peace agreement. In 1987, apparently Soviet Union leader Gorbachev delivered a letter from North Korea to President Ronald Reagan, where North Korea proposed a non-aggression treaty between the two Koreas, and then an agreement with the US to replace the armistice with a peace treaty. Even during the Clinton and Bush administrations, during the nuclear talks, they reiterated the same position. During President Obama's strategic patience, the same, replace the armistice agreement with a peace agreement. The 2018 summit agreements, the one that happened in Panmunjom between the two Korean leaders, and then in Singapore with Donald Trump, the same thing. End the war, replace the armistice with a peace treaty, establish a permanent and solid peace regime. However, in 2018, North Korea did make a clarifying commentary on what they mean about a peace agreement. And they said, it should not be a bargaining chip. The issue of ending the war or peace agreement is something that should have been resolved half a century ago. In 1954, in Geneva, that's what should have happened. So it's something that should happen regardless, because it's what's good for the world and it's good for the people of both countries. It is not to be used as a bargaining chip for North Korea's denuclearization. So what is the prospect for next year, and what is the path to peace? And I'm coming to the end now. I think that, as John mentioned, Biden will have many other domestic priorities, and COVID-19 being top on the list. So North Korea will not be a high priority for the Biden administration, at least not in the immediate future. So during this time, the priority then should be to avoid renewed tension, anything that will lead to deterioration of relationships, and maintaining trust so that you preserve the option of resuming talks when the parties are ready. Some possible trust-building measures are cooperation on humanitarian issues, showing a flexible approach towards sanctions, actions to avoid making any inflammatory statements, especially about the leader in Kim Jong-un. Also, large-scale U.S. ROK military exercises. These used to happen every year in the spring and in the fall. And there have been some talks about the U.S. resuming these exercises as early as next March. I think if the U.S. decides to move ahead with that, that could be the first flashpoint. I think we can see a response from North Korea in kind, in which case it will lead to renewed tensions. So we could see that as early as next spring. And then, of course, the ultimate goal eventually is to get back to the talks, get back to the table. But in order to do that, there actually needs to be an overhaul of US policy. The clue for what kind of a policy the US needs is actually in the agreements that the US has already signed with North Korea. We look at all of these agreements, the agreed framework in 1994, six-party talks joint statement in 2005, the Singapore agreement in 2018, they all have three things in common. They talk about normalizing relations, establishing a peace system, denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. So I think the path forward then has to be, we need to lead with peace. If we ask the question, what do we actually need to get to peace? Instead of asking, what do we need to disarm North Korea? I think then we come up with a different set of answers. We come up with a fundamental solution to the conflict. Establishing a peace system should be the primary goal. President Moon Jae-in recently called for ending the Korean War. I think this is a great step. This is a great idea, but it cannot be just a media spectacle. What it should be is a step toward what they already agreed to in the Panmunjom Agreement, 3 or 4 party conference, to replace the armistice with a peace agreement that commits all the parties to mutual arms reduction and a permanent peace system. And I'll just end by saying, I think that peace is possible. I think we must get there, and it is entirely up to us, the peace activists, people of conscience, especially in the United States, to organize, educate, lobby, protest, whatever we have to do to compel Washington, to persuade Washington to change course, change its way of looking at the world. And we have to lead with peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyun. This is really quite comprehensive, and I'm hoping that in the Q&A session there'll be a chance for you to talk a bit about the the plan that you've worked out with the networks. I want to take a few minutes just to focus in a little bit more on U.S.-Chinese tensions and to come back more deeply then in the Q&A. I think one of the things that our movement here in the United States needs to do, after having been so deeply immersed in the Middle East for the last 20 years, even as we have to continue considerable focus there, is people in the United States need to learn the map of Asia Pacific, need to get a much deeper understanding of what's been going on in that region. I think we need to understand that we're in what's generally called, or commonly called, the Thucydides trap, the classical tensions and conflicts that come when you have a declining empire and a rising empire. They bump up against one another, and in most cases, unfortunately, it's led to war, although war is not inevitable between the United States and China. We need to understand that China is soon to surpass the United States in terms of the size of its economy, and that leads to a whole range of pressures. We need to understand that we're in a period where U.S. and China have entered a period of intense economic, political, and military competition, which is functionally a new Cold War, and represents really a tipping point in terms of international relations now. It has huge impacts across the boards. Just to look at some of the unfolding fronts that we need to focus on. One is efforts by the United States to isolate China by pressuring other countries to downgrade their ties with Beijing. We see this with Australia, we see it with India. Hyun made reference to the Quad and the effort to build something analogous to, though not as strong as, NATO in order to contain China's militarily, but also economically and otherwise. In the last couple of months, we've seen a very intense sharpening of tensions around Taiwan. These had decreased in recent years, but Trump has really tried to ratchet up the tensions there and really bind the Biden administration in the future. The United States has been selling like $3.4 billion of new weapons to Taiwan, including some with offensive capabilities, and been signaling support, if not exactly for Taiwanese independence, but moving in that direction, sending increasingly high-level U.S. officials there to signal the U.S. commitment to China, to Taiwan. And obviously, people understand that for the Chinese, Taiwan is a renegade province and seeks to reunify it much as it did with Hong Kong. We need to understand that there have been very intense military confrontations, particularly in the South China Sea, but now also increasingly around Taiwan, with warships, fleets, and military aircraft. And the reality is that were there to be an accident, an incident, a miscalculation, it could all too easily escalate into a major conflict, especially when you think in terms of nationalism in China and in the United States. It is the arms, basically the desire to maintain U.S. military dominance over China that's driving the U.S. military spending now. Flournoy has said that her priority is in terms of new high-tech weapons development and getting rid of some of the old legacy elements. We have the issue of trade, and Trump has been trying to decouple the United States and Chinese economies. Biden will continue that to a degree, but the United States is limited in its ability to do this. I mean, just today, Germany signed on to Huawei and refused to join in the U.S. Boycott of it. And we have the charges that Chinese and Chinese American scientists and many students are spies. Some have been deported. And we have a situation, and I think it's really a high priority for our movement, has to be dealing with the anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism that has followed. A lot more can be said, but I think it's important for us to be, much as John was pointing to in relationship to Russia, to look at where we have common interests. They certainly lie in a response not only to this pandemic, but to the danger of future pandemics. Climate change, as John said, is an obvious priority. And there's a number of areas we can work together in terms of nuclear disarmament. I was on a webinar not long ago, and a number of Chinese nuclear experts were essentially saying that were the United States to move to a no first use policy, it could provide the foundation for considerably more diplomacy and common interest. So those are some of the areas to look at. There are a number of initiatives growing in relationship to trying to de-escalate the U.S.-Chinese crisis and to look for ways in which we can coexist and compete peacefully. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Cole, who's going to coordinate our Q&A.
Okay, 1 second. Just going to take a minute to get our panelists on the screen if I can. Okay, first I have, so Brian Campbell comments that Senate Democrats present $350 billion strategy to counter China. This is a New York Times article from September. Democrats rolled out sprawling legislation that proposes substantial new funding over a decade in a bid to reinvest in the nation's economy and challenge Beijing. It seems that Democrats are not open to China cooperation and free trade, especially Schumer of New York. Anyone care to comment on that? John.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that there has been a shift in kind of elite consensus on China. And the shift took place at the end of the Obama administration, but accelerated during the Trump administration. A shift truly away from kind of even limited engagement. And even the so-called liberal establishment in Washington secretly or quietly cheered what Trump was doing toward Russia, taking a much more hardline position on trade, much more hardline position even on, as Joseph was saying, on Taiwan, South China Sea. So it's not surprising in some sense that the Democratic Party reflects that shift in elite consensus on China. On the other hand, we also have to recognize that generally speaking, and this could be an exception, but generally speaking, in an election year, the party in opposition has used anti-China rhetoric as a way of criticizing the existing administration, but that when that opposition party takes power, it moderates its position on China. It becomes, shall we say, schooled in the realism of the necessity of maintaining positive trade relations with China and moderating some of the more aggressive, hawkish attitudes. So I think we will see that from the Biden administration and the Democrats when it comes to the economy. God knows the Democrats need to deliver to the Midwest, to farmers, and sanctions or tariffs on trade are just not going to be very useful for delivering to those constituencies. At the same time, we'll, as I said, we'll see some continued hostile approaches to China, and I think it's our job, as the speakers were saying, to really push as hard as possible for some for the win-win solutions with China, which will include, I think, a heavy emphasis on trade and economy, and obviously climate change, environmental cooperation.
Okay, anyone else want to jump in on that, or shall I take another question? Marla from the Global Sunrise Project says Biden's commitment to climate change, if serious, will force him to look at militarism. And if it doesn't, that's where we can get youth on board to hold his feet to the fire. So how does climate policy fit in with US-China confrontation and militarism? Jody.
Thanks. So yeah, thanks. A great question. And that's one of the reasons why we're working on a letter right now to Biden from environmental community to exactly articulate this. And so we're trying to get ahead of that. So we've been able, so we can organize the environmental community to also bring that into what they call for, as the devastation it is to the planet. And then also on China, cooperation on the planet is needed. And as I said, Jerry Brown just started a school at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, in collaboration with the negotiator for China at the Paris Accords to work on that. So in the attempt, I think I didn't say earlier, is that we need to build a big tent around China, and finding all the ways we can build that big tent. And certainly on the planet is one of them.
Thank you. Michael Hoey says he would like to better understand the concept of the color revolutions and the use of the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, and affiliated groups to keep going a kinder, gentler approach to regime change.
John, that's maybe your question.
All right. I think John had the map of Ukraine, so he probably provoked this question if anyone did. Go ahead, John.
Well, first, I want to emphasize that generally speaking, color revolutions where they took place, as well as the Arab Spring, are indigenous phenomena. I mean, these are activists like us rising up for a variety of different reasons. I mean, in Ukraine, it was a combination of a wide spectrum of groups, from the feminists, all the way to environmentalists, to liberals, and then off to the right wing as well. It was a pretty popular front type of organizing. You can find similar kind of formations around the world in the so-called color revolutions. So I want to emphasize that first and foremost, that whatever outside influence there was, I would estimate to be relatively small. And the really important kind of dynamics are to be understood within the countries themselves. And sometimes it's very difficult to generalize even across the color revolutions as well. So caution against that. Now, NED, of course, does have a variety of different programs that are designed to promote democracy, as their name puts it. And in some cases, that definitely does shade into regime change, especially if the regime is either non-democratic or not democratic enough for NED. And it's not just, Ukraine or Georgia or the Arab world. I mean, as Hyun knows quite well, NED has quite a lot of programs designed for North Korea as well, and for promoting change in regime in North Korea. How effective they are? Well, NED would like to believe that they're effective, but I frankly don't think they're that effective in terms of, money is of course appreciated by groups, but the agenda that the NED brings, generally speaking, is not adopted. But again, it depends from country to country. I'd also like to point out that there are some NED programs that are very good. I interviewed quite a number of people who work on Roma issues, for instance, throughout Eastern Europe, on discrimination questions, anti-racism trainings, So NED is not just, regime change stuff. And there's lots of stuff I disagree with, but there are some good programs there as well. So important to distinguish the good from the bad.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this is probably a dynamic that we might see more of vis-a-vis North Korea in the next administration. The NED does, as John mentioned, does fund a number of defector groups, North Korean defectors who are based in South Korea who call for regime change. Some of these groups are the ones who send the notorious balloons over the border. Not only are they environmental pollutants, but also, they're highly provocative messages that are sent over the border by the defector groups. And a lot of them try to delegitimize North Korea on their human rights record. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the next administration. But, we at Women Across DMZ have always pointed out the hypocrisy of the fact that, the same people who call for human rights in North Korea are the ones who call for sanctions against North Korea. And, we have to really investigate the impact of sanctions on the humanitarian situation in North Korea. And so we always say the fundamental solution is to end the Korean War. Once you end the situation of war, then you can actually dramatically improve the human rights of people on both sides. Yeah, but this is a dynamic that we will probably see more of in the next administration.
The only thing I would add is just the importance for us to think about building democracy here in the United States. There's the remarkable hypocrisy of the United States ostensibly exporting democracy while we have 2 million people in prison. And while we see the disenfranchisement of so many people in the recent election, the efforts at really distorting the structures, undermining the institutions of democracy. And while this was beaten back to a degree in Biden's victory, we need to appreciate that we have a very important political fight going on for the next 4 years. It's not over, and the work for democracy here, I think, goes hand in hand with our work for peace internationally.
Okay, next up we have Siddhartha Banerjee. Siddhartha?
Thank you. Joseph, that's a very incisive comment, and I think a lot of people in the world feel precisely that the U.S. should put its own house in order before exporting democracy to others. But my main comment today is that I feel rather wistful, given the state of Chinese and American relationships, with what the Chinese-American relationship used to be about 70, 80 years ago. There were many missionaries in China who were American. Pearl Buck was descended from one such family. And there was I think, a constituency for Chinese autonomy, Chinese dignity in the face of Japan's invasion, which I don't think is evident today. There's certainly no major figure like Pearl Buck who expresses the Chinese point of view in this country. The other thing is that I feel wistful for the relationship that used to be, because up in northeastern India, in the state of Assam, virtually all the civilian airports there were once United States Army Air Force bases for the Americans to supply goods and weaponry to the Chinese during World War II by flying over the hump. Why that relationship has now degenerated to this is, of course, grist for another time, but I certainly feel nostalgic about it. And my last point is this, that the Bay of Bengal and the Eastern Indian Ocean, I'm afraid, because India has now entered the Quad under this term, which is misleading, called the Indo-Pacific. There's no such region as the Indo-Pacific. There's the Bay of Bengal, there's the Indian Ocean, and then there's the Pacific Ocean. So this is a way to expand the theater of the conflict to India. If that happens, and if India plays along with this semi-NATO-like strategy, I suspect that the Eastern Indian Ocean will become militarized, and so will the Bay of Bengal. Not things to look forward to at all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just say that, you know, the efforts of the United States to undermine, you know, the communist government in China, you know, go back pretty far, right? It's interesting that I actually used to babysit for the goddaughter of the Dalai Lama, whose father had been the CIA agent responsible for arming and training the Tibetan rebels in the 1950s. And you know, the Chinese are well aware of this. And we have the history of U.S. nuclear threats against China, especially in the 1950s. So unfortunately, it's a long history. The one thing I would point out, kind of responding to Siddhartha, is to also just look at the contradictions. We were talking about democracy before, and what the United States has been doing, and actually this goes back to the Obama administration, the first head of state to have a formal welcome in the Obama White House was from India. And what we have, you know, in India is increasingly a authoritarian, repressive government, you know, totally anti-Islamic and repressive. And so we need to think about who the United States is allying with in its efforts to surround and isolate China.
Great.
Well, like I said in the beginning, it goes back to Iraq and the Middle East, and you can see the same patterns developing. And you just said that, you know, it's who are the playmates going to be, and they're really the worst, while they're talking about the people that they're going against being the worst. And we've got to keep an eye on that and raise that up.
Great. Now we have an economics question, as for a change of pace, from Phil Nichols. American business used to compete by developing and improving technology and industrial development. Manufacturing activities provided the laboratory for learning. When U.S. business moved manufacturing to China, it also gave them this laboratory, resulting in enhanced Chinese development. Now U.S. business competes by trying to stop Chinese development. If this is all true, isn't our tariff, military, propaganda policies mostly to stop Chinese industrial and technological development?
Yes. And I think also just that when you look at China, it's not just in manufacturing, it's in everything where iteration and change is literally part of the culture. And that you see that in politics, you see that their capacity to move on an issue and then create the change that has to happen is pretty fast. And so while in the US, we live in a it's very stuck for quite a while, and it's moving back and forth, but very little move forward. What you see in China is a constant reiteration. And one of the things they do is experiment a lot. So maybe one state will take an idea and they'll experiment, and the different states will experiment, different regions will experiment with different ideas. They'll see what works, and then others will adopt it. So there is, you know, yes, in manufacturing, but in so much. And I think that's, you know, what the US is afraid of, is they have moved forward too quickly, and they're frightened. And so they're throwing everything at stopping, instead of seeing that this could be healthy competition, which cuts the US off, because we're closing down Chinese involvement in universities. So there's no cooperation, even in the thought processes through universities, through how we used to share education and students. That's being cut off. It's going to hurt the United States more than it hurts China.
Okay, there's 3 people in this meeting that want to talk about Cuba instead of China, Russia, and North Korea. So I'm going to humor them. How do we see U.S.-Cuban relations under the new administration?
Can we call on Medea for that? Medea, you're the expert. You should be saying this.
Right.
Well, I'm happy to give my 2 cents. There's hope that on some of the the easier issues, like allowing Cuban Americans or anybody to send remittances to their family members in Cuba, those restrictions will be lifted. Some of the travel restrictions will be lifted. And maybe more, certainly a lot more was done during the Obama administration when there were they made the intersections into embassies. There were full staffing, but the pushback for Biden is going to be their continued belief that they want to get back Southern Florida seats in the next election, where they lost 2 Democratic House seats, rather than just conceding that those are Republican seats and go after other seats in Florida, like where the more liberal Puerto Ricans are and others. So I think there's going to be quite a fight going on in the Biden administration to at least do as much as the Obama administration did.
Great. And now I'm going to go back to Russia, China, and North Korea. Gary Goldstein asks, the U.S. nuclear buildup is justified by enmity with these 3 countries. How would reunification of Korea and better relations with China and Russia undermine the U.S. defense industries?
Well, you know, I just go back and remember Colin Powell, who, when was it, in the early 1990s, said he was running out of enemies and only had North Korea. And you know, the military industry depends on having enemies, and especially as we're in a situation where our economy is a mess. Our need for social investment and providing programs for the vast majority of U.S. people is urgent, and you can't pay for that with air. So greater peace, you know, would increase pressures to reduce military spending and to you know, fund human needs, which is, you know, what our priorities need to be.
I agree with that. The only reason to maintain the conflict with Korea for 70 years, this war has been unresolved for 7 decades. The only reason is because there are vested interests that profit from it. And that is basically the military contractors who sell weapons, saying, you know, North Korea is the perpetual enemy, is a threat. South Korea is one of the top weapons importers of U.S. weapons, and Japan as well, Taiwan. I mean, all the countries in the region, the reason why they buy up U.S. weapons is because, you know, they consider, you know, North Korea, China, Russia as threats. And what we're saying as Korea peace activists is actually there is an easy solution. There is a different way, which is make peace with Korea. You know, people on both sides want it. Both leaders of Korea have signed an agreement saying this is what they want. And, you know, Korea has no business being on China's side or the US side. It should be a neutral country that it should have the option to reunify if the people choose to. And that will actually improve the security of the region. But the only obstacle, I think the primary obstacle, is the military-industrial complex that continues to, it needs, as Joseph said, it needs a perpetual enemy. And same with China. I mean, why is China our new threat? 20 years ago, we blindly marched into war in the Middle East, and we are not safer. The Middle East is completely destabilized, and we didn't question, like, yeah, you know, there are terrorists in the Middle East, and we must be there. And then now we have we're like in a rush to say China is now the new enemy. But why? Why don't we stop and ask, like, is it really? And I think really this foreign policy team in the Biden administration, you know, they really are on this bandwagon of, or leading the bandwagon of painting China as a new enemy, so to justify increased Pentagon spending.
Great. Well, I think we could probably make that the last question. Joseph, I could announce a few upcoming events. I don't know if you want to make some closing remarks as well. Or maybe we could let each panelist.
Why don't you start with the events, and I'll figure out a couple things to say as we wrap up.
All right. So tomorrow night we have Samuel Moyne. He is a legal scholar, focuses in on human rights as well as on the legal justifications for war. So that promises to be a fascinating evening. I should probably put my picture up. Excuse my vanity. If I take a moment to do that. Well, I can't do it right. All right, whatever. Thursday night, we have Trita Parsi on the Iran nuclear deal. And as everyone knows, that is even more fraught than we thought when we scheduled this event a few weeks ago, since they have assassinated Iran's leading nuclear scientist. And a lot of the Democrats have done nothing to denounce that assassination. So we're going to talk about the prospects of restoring the Iran nuclear deal. And finally, on Saturday and Sunday, Mass Peace Action and 15 other groups are staging a 2-day conference, progressive strategy conference, called Where Do We Go From Here? Building Our Movements for the Next 4 Years. So we invite everyone to join us there. We have a host of interesting speakers and panels, and then on Saturday morning, we'll do a sort of coalition building and practical unity session. Joseph?
So I want to thank Jody, Hyun, and John for joining us. You know, I have any one of them could have spoken for at least an hour and you know, gone much more deeply. And I think we all need to go more deeply. But I want to appreciate what we've done, what we've raised here. I want to encourage people to you know, go to a number of different sites. John Pfeffer edits the Foreign Policy in Focus. You'll find a lot of great in-depth materials there across the range of issues we talked about tonight. Women Across the DMZ, you can find a whole lot more in terms of what people are doing across the country and ways you can engage and work to end the Korean War and build peace with both Koreas. And certainly Code Pink is prolific in what they put out, prolific in its programming. And I'd encourage people to check that out. And especially at the moment, as the tensions are, as Trump is ramping up the tensions with Iran, and really the central importance of renewing that that agreement, the CPOA with Iran. And finally, just to say that, you know, we're in for quite a ride in these next 4 years. Asia Pacific and relations with Russia are absolutely central. I'm glad for all of you who joined us, and I'm looking forward to working with you in the months and years to come. Carry on, stay well, and stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.